Under a fossil bed the government cleared to dig, a human bone was waiting to detonate a fight closed since 1890. This land is sold as a dig site, and Wounded Knee has settled history. Neither is true. The Park Service signed permits and secured funding before telling the Lakota it was starting on their land. Elder Ed Two Bulls needed no lab report. The bone confirmed what he'd said. This ground was never empty. It happened in April 2002 on Stronghold Table, reached by one narrow land bridge, the last place ghost dancers gathered before Wounded Knee. Here's what the world thinks it knows about the Badlands. A paleontological wonderland. One of the most fossil-dense landscapes on the planet. For 100 years, scientists have hauled 33-million-year-old titanotheres and strange pig-like beasts out of these eroding cliffs. The famous Big Pig dig alone ran for more than a decade, pulling ancient rhinos, horses, and pig-like Archaeotherium out of a single bone bed and feeding museum collections across the country. Tourists walk through visitor centers named after prehistoric mammals that no longer exist anywhere on Earth. The story sold to the public is simple, clean, and safe. This is a place of deep time, empty and available, a laboratory carved into stone, where the only real conflict is between wind and rock. Aerial footage of the Badlands shows exactly why people believe that. Miles of banded rock, no roads, no houses, nothing but wind and erosion. It looks abandoned, it isn't. That story has a problem. This land sits inside the Pine Ridge Reservation, on ground the Oglala Lakota considers sacred, the same plateau where ghost dancers gathered in the brutal winter of 1890, dancing in shirts they believed could stop bullets, weeks before soldiers opened fire at Wounded Knee. The National Park Service itself calls Stronghold Table the site of the last known ghost dance in American history. And in 2002, when paleontologists moved in to excavate fossils exposed by looters' pits, almost nobody outside the tribe seemed to remember that detail, until a bone forced them to. None of this makes the paleontologists villains. Park paleontologist Rachel Benton had a real, defensible scientific reason to be there. 3 years earlier, in 1999, looters had already torn open 19 separate pits across the plateau, stripping out titanothere fossils for the black market, leaving the site more damaged the longer it sat unprotected. Her plan was to document and rescue what remained before it disappeared into private hands for good. That's a legitimate institutional goal. It's also exactly the kind of urgency that makes it easy to move fast and notify people last. Science benefits if the fossils get pulled out and cataloged before another looter beats them to it. The tribe loses something else entirely if that happens. Not a specimen, but standing. The right to be asked first about ground they never stopped calling sacred. So who benefits if the Badlands stay just a fossil story? Who loses if the ground beneath those fossils turns out to hold something the museum brochures never mention? And who gets to decide, in the end, which version of this land's history counts as the official one? To understand why one bone stopped a federally funded excavation, you have to go back further than 2002, back past the fossil beds, back to 1868, when the United States signed the Fort Laramie Treaty, guaranteeing the Great Sioux Reservation, including this exact stretch of Badlands, to the Sioux Nations, permanently, on paper, in ink. Then gold turned up in the Black Hills. Miners poured in. In 1877, Congress broke the treaty outright and seized the land by force, without a single Lakota signature on the document that took it. A century later, in 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court finally ruled on the theft. The justices did not soften the language. They quoted the lower court's finding directly. This was a more ripe and rank case of dishonorable dealings than almost anything else in American legal history. The court ordered compensation, just over $100 million at the time, left untouched and gathering interest for more than 4 decades. That fund has since grown past $1 billion. The tribes have refused every cent of it. Taking the money would mean legally admitting the land was ever for sale in the first place. The Black Hills are not for sale, is a line Oglala leadership still repeats, word for word, in Senate testimony to this day. A stack of uncashed government checks, in other words, sitting untouched for 2 generations, because cashing them would erase the claim entirely. Then came Wounded Knee. December 29th, 1890. Congress itself acknowledged in a formal 1990 resolution that as many as 375 Lakota men, women, and children were killed or wounded that single freezing morning, some of the bodies left in the snow for days before burial. The ghost dance that preceded it was not a footnote to the tragedy. It was a spiritual movement born out of desperation, hunger, and broken promises, built around a belief that the old world could be sung and danced back into existence. Stronghold Table was its last refuge, the final place believers gathered before the army closed in from every direction and the dancing stopped for good. And the land kept getting taken. In 1942, the U.S. Air Force seized 341,726 acres of Pine Ridge outright for a bombing range, giving families as little as 2 weeks to pack up generations of life and leave. Sources disagree sharply on how many families were forced out. Some records say 125, others say more than 800, a gap in the paperwork that has never been fully reconciled, even now, 80 years later. Live unexploded ordnance reportedly still surfaces in that ground today, decades after the last bomb was dropped in practice. When the range was declared surplus in the 1960s, only part of it went back to the tribe. The rest was folded into an expanded Badlands National Park under a 1976 agreement that promised joint management between the Park Service and the Oglala Sioux tribe. 50 years later, some Lakota activists call that promise dead. Never real control, just the appearance of it, useful for a brochure and nothing more. So when Benton finally got official approval in 2002 to survey and excavate those looted pits, with funding from the South Dakota School of Mines and the Denver Museum of Nature and Science already secured, the tribe wasn't formally notified until April, after every arrangement had already been made. Some critics have argued the timing wasn't accidental at all, that notification was delayed on purpose to lock in funding before resistance could organize. Nobody has proven that. But the paper trail makes it an easy theory to believe. Tribal President John Yellow Bird Steele's response was blunt. The Park Service did not have unilateral authority to send outside institutions onto tribal treaty land. Members of the Tokala Society set up camp directly on the land bridge and turned back more than 100 hikers trying to reach the site, some of them tourists who had no idea they had walked into the middle of a standoff. One protester, Keith Janis, reportedly staked himself to the ground rather than move, a single act of resistance that outlasted every permit the Park Service had signed. The bone Ed Two Bulls had pointed to belonged to a young woman, and it was never forensically dated on the record. Advocates called it evidence of a massacre-era grave. Nobody has confirmed that either way. And that uncertainty is exactly why the dig never resumed. That's a powerful story on its own. It's also incomplete, because the same soil holding a disputed grave also holds something the archaeological record can genuinely date, measure, and confirm, and that evidence doesn't settle the argument. It complicates it even further, in a direction almost nobody expects. Inside the park's north unit, at a site called Johnny, archaeologists uncovered a real late prehistoric village, pottery fragments, a stone drill, bone tools, a flattener carved from bison bone, arrow points scattered across the old living surface, radiocarbon dated to roughly 975 to 1172 AD. First tested in 1958, then re-examined decades later by the Park Service's own Archaeology Center. It is the only site inside the entire park formally eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. And here's the detail almost nobody mentions on the tour. That village wasn't Lakota. The people who lived there were most likely ancestors of the Arikara, Earth Lodge farmers who worked this exact White River country long before the Lakota ever arrived on horseback from the woodlands near the Great Lakes. A few miles north, at another site called Pinnacles, archaeologists found the remains of a bison jump, a hunting technique that predates the Lakota's own arrival by centuries. The Lakota's own migration onto these plains happened later, through the 1700s, pushed west by conflict with the Ojibwe, not some ancient, unbroken residency the visitor signs sometimes imply. So the 11,000 years of native use language printed in park brochures is real, but it is stretched thinner than it sounds. The actual radiocarbon dates recovered from inside the park stop at roughly 2,300 years ago. The oldest confirmed human evidence anywhere near the Badlands does not come from inside the park boundary at all. It comes from the Langs-Ferguson site nearby, where archaeologist Adrian Hannes uncovered 2 butchered mammoths lying alongside Clovis spear points still wedged in the bone, dated to almost 13,000 years old, genuinely the oldest dated archaeological site in South Dakota. That date lines up with a much bigger genetic picture. Ancient DNA pulled from a Clovis-era infant burial in Montana, published in Nature in 2014, confirmed that the earliest known people on this continent are the direct ancestors of native nations living today, closing the door on old fringe theories that had tried to trace Clovis technology back to Ice Age Europe instead. Later studies pushed the picture further, showing that a single founding population split into northern and southern genetic branches more than 14,000 years ago, long before anyone could have called themselves Lakota, Arikara, or anything else. Real evidence, on a continental scale. Just not evidence that settles who this specific stretch of ground belongs to now. Lakota DNA had been studied before, just never to answer a question like this one. Immunogenetics researchers had already mapped tissue-type markers across 2 Lakota Sioux tribes, the first study of its kind for any Northern Plains nation, useful for organ matching and disease research, but silent on ancestry, silent on ownership, silent on graves. Then, in 2021, a different kind of test landed, and this one had a name attached that changed everything. A research team led by geneticist Eske Willerslev extracted DNA from a lock of hair cut from Sitting Bull's scalp more than a century earlier, hair that had sat inside a Smithsonian storage drawer for decades before being returned to his descendants in 2007. The sample was old, fragmented, chemically degraded, the kind of DNA that normally falls apart before it can answer anything. Building a method precise enough to work with material that damage took the team 14 years of trial and failure. When it finally worked, the results confirmed what family oral history had claimed all along. Ernie LaPointe, living quietly in Lead, South Dakota, was Sitting Bull's great-grandson, his closest living descendant, verified in a laboratory, published in a peer-reviewed journal, using a technique that had never been attempted on remains this old and this damaged before. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. LaPointe had pursued the test partly to gain legal standing over what happens next to Sitting Bull's remains. Still held today in Mobridge, decades after they were first moved from where he was killed and buried. A DNA result meant to confirm a bloodline instead reopened a decades-old fight over who controls a body after death, a fight involving multiple towns, competing burial claims, and a family that had spent generations being told to simply take the government's word for who their ancestor was. The test didn't close a case. It reopened one and forced a harder question into daylight. Why did a Lakota family need a laboratory's permission slip to claim their own ancestor in the first place? Put those threads side by side, a disputed grave the science can't fully date, a village that predates the Lakota themselves, a continental DNA record that confirms deep ancestry but not local ownership, and a genetic test that reopened a fight over a body everyone assumed was settled. and the fossil dig starts to look like something else entirely. This wasn't really a paleontology story. It was a second excavation of Wounded Knee using different tools, a century later. The shovels changed. The argument underneath them never did. Because the pattern didn't stop at Stronghold Table. Across the country, objects taken from the Lakota after 1890 kept surfacing in places nobody expected and refusing to come home easily. In Glasgow, Scotland, a ghost dance shirt taken from a body at Wounded Knee had been sold to a museum in 1892 by a traveling showman connected to Buffalo Bill's Wild West tour. It sat unrecognized behind a glass for a full century until a native visitor identified it in 1992. It took until 1999 for the city council to finally agree to return it, after survivor descendant Marcella LeBeau spent years demanding it back, then spent years more still seeking the return of a baby bonnet, moccasins, and a necklace that never came with it, items she pursued until her death in 2021 at age 102. In a small library museum in Barre, Massachusetts, more than 150 objects taken after Wounded Knee sat quietly in storage for decades, the institution claiming exemption from federal repatriation law because it received no government funding. They weren't finally returned until November 2022, arriving at Pine Ridge on December 29th, the anniversary of the massacre itself, boxes carried in like something between a homecoming and a funeral. And at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, children's items taken from Wounded Knee, including a small saddle and a doll's shirt, reportedly still hadn't been returned as of 2023, despite a direct request from a documented descendant of a massacre survivor. A federal review found roughly 870,000 Native American artifacts and nearly 110,000 human remains still sitting inside institutions across the country that are legally required to give them back. That same year, the tribes bought back 40 acres of the actual Wounded Knee massacre site, pulling it out of private ownership for good after decades of failed negotiation with the family that had controlled it. Oglala President Frank Starr comes out, told a Senate committee in 2023 that the site still needed federal protection as a memorial. The bill stalled. It was reintroduced in the next Congress. It still hasn't passed. And in 2024, the federal government overhauled the rules governing Native American remains entirely, imposing what regulators called a formal duty of care and requiring free, prior, and informed tribal consent before any institution can even study, display, or access remains or cultural items, a regulation that would have made the 2002 excavation at Stronghold Table illegal to attempt the same way today. Museums across the country responded by quietly covering entire exhibits overnight, uncertain which objects now required consent they didn't have, repatriation notices for Sioux-affiliated remains, and objects were still being filed as recently as this year. The paperwork trickling out case by case, decades after most of these items were first taken. Think about what that means for Stronghold Table, specifically. The dig that started this whole story couldn't legally happen the same way today, not because the fossils became less valuable and not because the science became less important, but because the law finally caught up to what the Tokala Society was already saying with their bodies on that land bridge back in 2002. The proposal to make Badlands National Park's South Unit the country's first tribal national park, floated by the Park Service itself back in 2006, still has not happened 2 decades on. A group calling itself the Grassroots Oyat has gone further, calling the 50-year-old co-management agreement dead in practice. Never real tribal authority, they argue, just the appearance of one dressed up for federal paperwork. Their position is blunt. If the land was never really shared, stop pretending and give it back outright. The Park Service's own planning documents have floated tribal management as the preferred path forward. 2 decades later, nobody has actually signed anything that makes it real. Stand on that land bridge at Stronghold Table today, and nothing about it looks resolved. The wind still moves the same way it did in 1890. The looters' pits have been filled back in. The bone was quietly reburied, its identity never confirmed, never fully denied, no headstone, no case file closed. A few miles away, the visitor center carries the name of Ben Riefel, a Sikangu Lakota man who became the first person of Sioux descent elected to Congress, a quiet honor, sitting within sight of ground the tribe, and the federal government still cannot fully agree on, decades after the fossils themselves were cataloged, studied, and safely explained behind glass. Somewhere in a federal storage facility tonight, thousands of objects taken from these same families are still sitting on shelves, waiting on paperwork that has never been finished. A shirt in Scotland took 107 years to come home. A saddle in New York is reportedly still waiting. The prehistoric animals got their answers. The people never did. That single land bridge is still the only way in. On one side, a fossil bed the world has fully mapped, its bones sorted, dated, and shelved. On the other, a grave nobody has been allowed to close, a treaty nobody has been allowed to honor, and a park still governed by a 50-year-old promise nobody can quite agree was ever real. Every road sign, every visitor center, every fossil case tells one half of what happened here. The other half is still waiting on paperwork. It is still down there, under Stronghold Table in storage boxes in New England, in a bill sitting unfinished in Congress in a fund nobody will cash, waiting for whoever digs next.